Good evening and namo over to everyone. This is Abhivadan from Indus Think, and this is the second monologue after the one I had with Amrita. So we are coming up with a few monologues to discuss some specific ideas and some specific phenomena. So here we have the second one with Sri Raghav Krishnaji. So I would like to introduce Raghavji to the viewers. Raghav is currently he is the co-founder and the associate dean academics, if I'm right, of Rashtra School of Public Leadership. Rashtram is a very innovative institution when it comes to not but just about preserving, but also putting forward a knowledge economy perspective when it comes to education and even quality research in Indic knowledge systems. And from a public policy perspective, Rashtram is young as an institution, but has done a lot much work which must be understood with a much wider angle, especially for the Indians. So tonight we will be discussing about India as a Rashtra and the Bhartiya consciousness. And this will be discussed from a perspective of education because this is at the heart of the Indians, what happens with them and how should they approach it when it comes to civilizational intransigence, as we talk about these things all the time. So Raghavji, namaste. Welcome to Indus Think, and pleasure to have you.
Namaste everyone. On a good gig. I'm glad to be here. It's quite a few big words there: civilization, knowledge, rastram, and also a monologue. I hope to have a conversation with you around how I've come to develop a conviction in the intellectual traditions of our land, how that led to the kind of work that we do at Rashtra. What is the idea? How is it different? How is it relevant? And hopefully there's certain value out of it that your viewers will get. Very, very happy to be here.
Indeed. So, as we proceed, a very basic question that anyone would ask who may not be aware about Rashtram is what is the purpose of the organization? And before, of course, getting that, how do you see your journey? And if you can give some, you can just explain about it in your own words, in your own way, I would say, as to how your journey has led to Rashtram and how do you see your own contributions when it comes to Indic knowledge systems and what people call civilizational awakening or civilization renaissance, so to say. So, yes, I'm using some heavy words, but yeah, there you go.
No, sure. I'd like to begin with that actually, talk a little bit about my own journey and what that meant for me in terms of my awareness. And when we talk about Indian civilizational inheritance or knowledge systems in particular, the equation is firmly loaded on the civilizational side and firmly against our contribution, our current contribution. So when we say we contribute to Indic knowledge systems, at this point we are really the legatees and the inheritors of this knowledge system who are just barely scratching the surface of trying to understand the magnificence that is India's knowledge system and how we can contemporize that to solve not just the problems that we have today, but also present a vision for the future, not just for India, but also for the entire world. And my journey has actually been a journey of developing this intellectual clarity and also the moral imagination that this is something that is worth doing. My background, I was born, brought up, raised and spoiled in Hyderabad, resurrected also in Hyderabad. I worked in the game development industry for more than a decade and a half before I moved into public policy. My last role was in a company called Electronic Arts, where we used to make mobile games for the international audiences. So my world was fun and trying to actually create fun, which is very, very difficult. And it was filled with conversations around systems, design, art, technology, marketing, consumers, behavioral psychology that goes into games, obviously the business side, and also just the aspect of running large teams engaged in creative product development. So I have a grounding in multidisciplinary product development environment, and I would say that has shaped me significantly in terms of the temperament that I have of working with people and looking at talent I think it's also relevant because you structured this conversation around knowledge economy. Around the time that I started working on mobile games and before it became ubiquitous, is the time that you saw small organizations with 20, 25 people getting 20 billion valuations. Right? Look at WhatsApp, look at a gaming company called Supercell, works out of Finland, a lot of other examples. This is, in fact, a space where the human creativity and ingenuity has disproportionate influence. Right? We all hear about the 10x programmer, but there is also the 10x designer, there's also the 10x artist. But all of that working together towards a particular vision and then respecting the consumer choice. This is really my background. But the challenge was as fun and as interesting it was to work with talented, quirky people and just try and develop something good. There were deeper questions that always sort of piqued my interest in the context of who we are and how we've come to be where we are, and what is really India's place in the world. And it's inevitable because you are interacting with a lot of people across the world, and you're also running a team here. And you see a lot of very specific attributes that come out in conversations that you have, in the culture that you see that inhabits different places in the world. And like anybody else, my seeking was to understand my own place in the world a little better. And I realized that you cannot do that unless you understand India's place in the world itself. And that led me to, just like everyone else who's interested in something like this, reach out to literature, reach out to things that you want to hear, learn, and reflect on. And in that process, I've come to a point where the prevailing sort of theories run out of explanations because there is so much of it's almost a schizophrenic existence, right? Because you have a very rich intellectual tradition. You're able to see this in your culture, in your own relatives. You see people who are whose intelligence and talent dazzles you, and but you also hear regularly when you are working with large teams about how certain things cannot happen in India. For example, this whole debate around how India in the IT section is only a services economy and not really a product economy. And why is that? Its talent or knowledge is not really unique to any one place. And a civilization that has been there for such a long time, with such tremendous achievement all around, cannot be relegated to an idea like that. So these things led me to understanding India from the perspective of our knowledge traditions. I first initially tried to find some solutions in the public policy space to understand how public policy is structured. And I think that is vital because ultimately, whatever the state does will always have a tremendous impact. But then you also understand that the state philosophy runs on certain political philosophy paradigms. So you can trace out the intellectual heritage of your own current political realities through the political philosophies that have come to inhabit our system. But then you realize that they lack, beyond a certain point, the ability to explain the truth in a way that you are able to observe in your own society. When we talk about education in a short while, we realize why that is so. But in my own particular case, that led me to exploration of the metaphysics of Indian knowledge. And that is where I am currently situated. When I look at a certain issue or when I form a perspective around things now, my de facto position is to look at this from the Indian and particularly the Hindu metaphysics, which I think are not just profound, but also are forever relevant. What we call Sanatana, what we call the eternal civilization, is really what in a recent work Pawan Verma calls the audacity of ideas or audacity of thought. Right? How did these guys think about a civilizational infrastructure like this, and how lucky we are to inherit that knowledge tradition? So my journey, my own intellectual exploration, my own conviction in the ideas that I come to represent, But more importantly, the relevance of that for a just world has come from this exploration, from this journey of working with different people, trying to understand people. Through that, trying to answer certain questions about India and India's place, just trying to uh, harmonize the different debates that you are just sort of engaged in as part of any organization. And then getting a little bit into public policy, political philosophy, and through that, through the metaphysics. But I say all of this as a student. It's very, very important for those of us who are engaged in the civilizational discourse. And you are in the think, and in the reel that you just showed before we began speaking, I saw Dharma, Artha, Kama. These are extremely profound ideas, and in the last 3 years that I've been engaged in this, I've had the good fortune of interacting with real scholars, people who actually study this, and there is a tradition of knowledge and tradition of inheritance of this knowledge that those of us who are in the mainstream education have actually very, very little idea about, and therefore have not come to respect. So when I use these words these days, I'm a lot more sober and a lot more measured in how I use them. And that's actually that's also been my own epistemic evolution in a sense, because when you come into contact with the tradition of knowledge and the rigor it takes to actually live that knowledge, because India's knowledge is not an intellectualized one alone. There is a lot of philosophical contemplation, but there is a huge emphasis on the kind of person that you are and what it becomes, what knowledge does to you in terms of transformation. So when I use these words now, and when I came into contact with India's knowledge traditions, that was my moment of liberation, simply because you realize that you cannot beat your ancestors, and there is great comfort in that, because you're not competing against anyone. Then you realize that you just surrender to the magnificence of their vision and their ability to think about things and create things and give you, what we really enjoy as a civilization, as our inheritance. So that's been my journey, and I'll talk a little bit about the institution and how all these ideas find an expression in the institution. But if there was anything that you wanted to comment on that.
Sure. Quite a beautiful description, of course. Anyone would say that, even I would say that. But yeah, I think you put up a very interesting assertion, and which is I found very reasonable, that often it is assumed that uh, if you go for a scale of progress, there should be a sense of linear conflict, and that has been the model of progress for many. But for Asian civilizations like India, China, Japan, Korea, and so on, like if we see the history of Indochina, the Indian subcontinent, which is popularly known as Jambudvip according to the Puranas, uh, we see that there is an understanding of continuity. An even notable thinker, as well as one of the bastions of Sanatana Dharma, I must say, Aurobindo used to say that, what, we are a civilization which believes in continuity, while some others have their own, but we are more towards the aspect of immortality, as they say. So I think you raised an interesting point, that we don't need a conflict consideration when it comes to our past and our present. Instead of that, let's see where things can bridge in, and how, I would say, the bullet train or whatever it is goes ahead. So, yeah.
Cool. No, very quickly picking on that element of what gives our civilization the element of eternality. Right? What is it? Why is it distinct? Sri Aurobindo, of course, was always there, looming large. Uh, but if you were to understand it as a concept, a lot of our conversation today is around the politics of identity. A lot of other conversation or identity formations are around sociological realities. Right? So, if you look at thought disciplines or streams of thought that inhabit our discourse today, politics, sociology occupy a huge amount of cultural landscape and discourse landscape. Right? But the distinction that Indian civilization has, and I think the secret to its endurance is pointed out by Sri Aurobindo, Radhakrishnan, almost everyone who understands Indian civilization, is that the idea comes from cosmology itself. You start thinking about it as a spiritual civilization. You trace from the cosmological to the social, to the cultural, and then at the family level. And politics is a part of that, but you're not preoccupied with your political identities because you sort of expanded the range of your identity formation and established a link right from cosmological. So what we call a spiritual civilization, which is why it gives the civilization the nature of permanence, is that it traces its roots not to a social or a political idea, but it traces it to the very truth of existence or very source of existence, right? And we don't, I feel that we don't particularly understand the significance of this yet. Right? How did this question, you know, we've also probably because of the kind of emphasis that we have on skepticism, reason, and sense or individuality that modern education gives you. I think we've paid for it with a sense of wonder, right? And there is a sense of awe that I find missing in our inquiries. If you're able to just have a cognitive shift and start asking some exploratory questions, and that is also the nature of Indian exploration. In fact, it is not so much about empirical inquiry alone. It has also been about hypothesis and deduction on extremely subtle matters, right? And when we think about our civilizational knowledge systems, it's important to remember that our cognitive processes themselves are very different, and therefore our meaning making is very different. The way we think about our society, you mentioned conflict. For us, it's actually doesn't mean that we don't understand conflict or we're not realists. But because there is an emphasis and there is a recognition, and this recognition is not intellectual alone. This recognition is reinforced by the kind of people that you see who experience that bliss. It's very, very important to understand that the civilization, when we say it's a living civilization, is essentially about finding people in all parts of the land. You go to any part of Bharat, you will find people who will just blow your mind with their sense of oneness, with the way they look at things. And because this is reinforced at such proximate levels, you understand that the civilization has something far deeper than just a political identity or a social identity to wrap itself with. So our conflict is about how do we transcend. It's not so much about identity formations. Because there is the idea of transcendental and there is the possibility of that in your own lived experience. I think that element of being able to respect wisdom when you see it and not let your skepticism come in the way of being able to respect is critical to our continuity. And when we think about education, education should also be about how does it harmonize faith, reason, logic, cognitive process, culture, social dilemmas, and when we speak about our journey at Rashtra and what we are attempting to do, I think this is a very, very important observation about lack of conflict. There will always be conflict in any society, but we don't make a cultural artifact out of it. Right? So, thank you for it.
You put a very interesting point, which is regarding the perpetuity itself. And it's something which is more about the role of consciousness than identity, which is basically what many people even talk about. So, considering that, I have a very simple question now as to since you discussed about your journey and we also went a little bit deeper into the aspect of, I would say, continuity and immortality, to so to speak. Uh, how Rashtram came up as an idea in the sense, and how it has been for years, I must say, and of course we'll discuss more deeper aspects of it, but maybe you can give it kind of an introduction.
Sure, yeah. So Rastram is a manifestation or a transformation of what was earlier called Vision India Foundation. Vision India Foundation was incubated at IIT Delhi in 2014, and in the backdrop of the fervor, the political the increase in political consciousness amongst the young people, starting from 2010, the whole CAG, and then the Anna movement, and you can imagine what was happening in campuses in Delhi at that time. And it was a very organic response, but a systemic one. It wasn't a reactionary one. The idea that Vision India Foundation had at its inception was how do you connect young people to systems of governance? There is a lot of energy and passion for what we call nation building, and we are able to see that consciousness rise. We also see when you interact with public leaders, policymakers, and bureaucrats outside of their system, there is a lot of willingness to engage. There is, in fact, almost a tremendous devotion to doing something good. But sometimes that kind of intent does not find a full expression through the system. And in our interactions, we found that if you're able to build bridges between young people and policymakers, you could actually try and architect a systemic change. Because ultimately, whatever we mean by an institution would be a combination of culture, people, and leadership. So we began with that idea, and the idea manifested in a few programs. Significant was a policy boot camp that we had arranged, a 21-day residential boot camp, which for many young people, it was their first exposure to the world outside of their particular discipline. That there is a world at the intersection of individual, state, market, and society. And there is something called public policy that emerges as a negotiated compromise, from all of these dimensions. So it was a huge success, and a lot of young people really felt that their horizons had expanded, and that gave us the confidence, a real feel that this had value. We then launched a few travel-based programs, and the idea there was you get a lot of stories from media about governance, administration, and politics, and typically the narrative is defeatist, and it is not elevating. Of course, there is always going to be the job of putting spotlight on what's wrong, but there is not enough context around how things are actually getting built in India. And so we wanted to address that immersive way by taking people to places of actual projects and actual examples of good governance. Right? So we called it the Good Governance Yatra. Typically, it's a travel-based immersive pedagogy. We took a delegation of about 50, 60 people, usually on a circuit tour of about 4 or 5 states. We curated about 8 or 10 projects for them, built interactions with the policymakers, help the delegation understand how does administration really work? What does it mean to acquire land in an area? What does it mean to actually get permissions? How does resettlement happen? How do you actually work at the intersection of societal representation, justice, but also trying to build infrastructure? So this was another experiment that really took off well, and we got a very good response. We curated an international edition of this. We had something called a World Governance Expedition. This was a program which the seed of the thought was from the Good Governance Yatra, to take young people and put them in proximity with good examples of leadership in the public space, but do that in an international sense. So we took a delegation to US, a delegation to UK. We took one to Russia, I think 3 times to Singapore, and 3 times to Israel, or maybe 2 times to Singapore. So the idea was also to build a global youth alliance network where young people who are interested in systems of governance and thought start forming relationships very early in their careers. And as they progress, they also become cultural ambassadors for their nations, but also solidarity emerges around common priorities for nations, right, through these relationships. So that's something that we had done. We then designed a program for executives called the Public Policy Program for Executives. These formats exist, in many places in India. The idea here was working professionals, people who are looking to get into policy making as a career, trying to also understand how it is and what it means to work with the government. We ran that was the first structured sort of curriculum that we built around what public policy education looks like. But all of this was around an idea of civilizational consciousness. Right? Whatever we did, of course, we draw our inspiration from Sri Aurobindo and Swami Vivekananda. Our icons, people that we are animated by, these giants of Indian civilization. So we always try to infuse whatever we do with a little bit of awareness around the Bharat quotient, if you will. Right? No, we've done this for 4 or 5 years, and we got a fairly good brand going. We were also happy young team trying to do all of these things, and there's a lot of vibe around it as well because you're traveling, meeting important people, running networks of thousands of people. But somewhere around around that time, 2017 and 18, having run these programs for 4 years, we began to question ourselves a little bit more seriously on whether we are serving the mandate that we claim to represent, which is to represent or to build a civilizational consciousness. And what does that really mean? Right? Because ultimately, we are working at some public policy training level, which is important. But the public policy is a downstream function of certain institutional culture. And that institutional culture draws from certain political philosophies and theories of sociology. And they themselves come from a very different history and metaphysics. Right? So when you trace this, I must admit, it was a sobering exercise to realize that in all our earnest effort, in all of our sincere striving, we might actually end up being a negative influence because we are arousing a passion for nation building, a conviction for action in young people, but sort of sending them to institutions that might not exactly represent that kind of culture, right? And we've also seen a lot of people disillusioned by it. So we felt that we need to move this idea and this discourse from an analytical mode of public policy to an ownership mode of public leadership. That you go back and actually invest in really training and building people to endure in whatever they pick up. And I think this is a vacuum in public policy education and more broadly liberal arts education. And when we did that is when my own exploration and our team's exploration began around Indic knowledge systems. So when you're looking at building human potential, right, and you're getting into theories of what it means to be, a high potential individual, a high potential leader, you start to think about the way we are constructed very differently, right? Ultimately, we are a composite of our physical, emotional, social, spiritual, and interpersonal selves. Right? And there are cognitive processes to build intelligence in all of these things. But what's happening in liberal arts education when we began exploring this is that, and this is largely true of leadership education as well, that we have not really focused on the emotional, psychological, spiritual dimensions in our education enough. We focused a lot on certain dimensions of physical intelligence, and definitely a lot on the cognitive dimension, but we haven't sufficiently developed human potential on the other dimensions. And this is also linked to the theme that we put out today in terms of knowledge economy. Knowledge economy, firstly, is about knowledge, right? And knowledge without a fundamental grounding of self-knowledge is not really knowledge. So we had this recognition and we said we got to do something about it. It's not enough if you just give Kingdon schema and Lance Pritchett theories around public policy. All of them are critical, right? It's not to deride anything. But ultimately, the ability to use any of this, rests with the individual. And if you're not able to invest and elevate the human potential, you are actually supplying a level of thought or a kind of paradigm which does not have the right container, right? It does not rest well. Right? You're not stable. If you're not stable, how the hell are you going to do anything that endures? Right? So this led us to rethink not just the kind of education or the kind of role that we want to play, but also the kind of structure that we need to give ourselves to do that. And that's when we thought seriously about becoming an academic institution. Because this kind of education requires a larger, more intimate, deeper interaction with the learners or with the seekers. So we had the purpose. We had the source and the fount in terms of Indic knowledge systems. We had to find the right house for that. Luckily for us, we are lucky to have a house in Rishihood University. So So Rashtra School of Public Leadership, the transformation from Vision India Foundation to Rashtra School of Public Leadership, got formalized in an association with Rishihood University. It's a university registered by the government of Haryana. We are in Sonipat, Haryana, very close to a lot of other educational institutions of repute. So there is also the whole ability to attract talent, get people. So we started working on the curriculum with this idea of a public leadership program that focuses on principles of governance and systems, but in an anchor of stability drawn from the Indic knowledge systems. And I'll get into what we mean by this. But this is important to, in our story, the story that we tell ourselves. It is also a choice between becoming a movement and becoming an institution. When you conceive of any change and change of a public nature, public participation, the movement is one kind of design, right? And the movement seeks to co-opt and collaborate with anyone at a common minimum program level, right? Because you are expansive in nature. You want to build momentum as much as possible. An institution, on the other end, actually tries to look inward in certain ways. It looks at what it is made up of. It looks at how it can organize itself. It looks at what it comes to stand, and it looks at replication. Right? And these are very, very different organizational development design models. And it was also a conscious choice for us to get into the institution more, because what we do has to speak through Rashtra, not through the charismatic leadership of one person or one or two ideas that we rally behind as projects, but as an institution and as people who are working to build endurance and build a new sort of experiment, and hopefully an experiment that becomes successful and therefore becomes a paradigm, and as a model for liberal arts education itself in India. Right? So that meant that we had to look inward to build the team that we need to. And I'm very, very proud of the kind of people that we have. And quite honestly, whatever I represent here is what I learn from the people that I work with on a daily basis. People who've spent their lifetimes. Sampadanand Mishra ji is a Sanskrit scholar and a person who's done a tremendous amount of work in just rebuilding the idea of pedagogy for Sanskrit. Right? Dr. Mala Kapadia ji is there for us. She is a person who's spent the last 3 decades thinking about yoga and Ayurveda and building knowledge around it. So Divakar ji, very senior educationist and a person who passionate about education and human potential development in the real sense of building it towards sustainability and ecology. She's on board. Srijit Datta, very, very bright professor with a deep understanding of Indian philosophy, aesthetics, and the political philosophies from all over the world. Dr. Pankaj Saxena, whose life has been spent mostly in temples and documenting India's temple traditions and cultures, and how institutions of temples, things that we don't learn about in our liberal arts curriculum, how they actually bind communities together. So this is the world that I inhabit, right? And when we say Indic knowledge systems, it's also about being able to learn from people who are institutions themselves. And I can proudly say that there are a few people in our institution who are also by themselves institutions. So this has been our journey of trying to reflect honestly, trying to build something, then gathering people who can do it, and then being honest about what the program offers, what the institution stands for. The one thing that I'm very, very happy about is that we've started our program this year. We've got a cohort of 25 young learners. And you must also imagine this, Abhibatul. This is not a typical quintessential program with a career promise at the end of the day. We're talking about transformation. We're talking about Indic knowledge systems. There is tremendous cognitive dissonance in all of these words, right? For young people to imagine that they will spend a year trying to learn something that is not their background, and then with not an assured prospect. Right? So this is a responsibility that we've taken up to build leadership in these people and handhold them. So we have a lot of emphasis on the mentoring dimension at Rashtra. Right? How do you actually enable conversations for transformation, and how do you handhold people to just become responsible, to become stable, and through that act of transformation, they become assets for the nation. So that's where we are.
I must say this is a very beautiful explanation again, but yeah, to add something on this, I think many public policy programs come in India, and that's a common trend. But and even to be very honest, uh, I do not share any enthusiasm that many have towards them, and this is not a matter of comparison at all. But I think this is more about the issue as to if something is there, then is it there with a perpetuating sense or not? And I think you addressed that in a very mature, a very beautiful way, I would say, and in a much kind way, I must say. So here is a very interesting comment on YouTube. For to share it, maybe you would appreciate it. This is a comment by Namrata A. She
Yeah.
says exploring what it means to be civilizationally assured and self-aware has been the pursuit since day one of Rashtra Accelerator program. It has been deeply humbling, and I'm very grateful for this. So thank you so much for the comment. I hope that the message has reached. So definitely.
Thank you, Namrata. No, this is something that I think represents what we're attempting to do. One is the self-awareness and stability that I mentioned, but the other dimension is the ability to represent your civilizational authentically, right? To be assured that you inherit something of value, you inherit something that you're proud preserving and promoting, and what your ancestors stood for, what your society has built, and what you have, what you represent as part of your inalienable identity is not something to be ashamed of. It is something to be proud of. It has something of value. It always has something of value to contribute to the world. That also, leads me to just maybe if we have continuity there, I can talk a little bit about the program design itself and how we aim to architect this. Right? So the program is a one-year leadership development program. We also offer a Master of Arts in Public Leadership. That is a two-year program. We are in the process of building the curriculum for a four-year undergrad program in public leadership. And idea is to take Indic knowledge systems across all levels of education. In fact, I'm very excited to inform you that, and your viewers through this program, that in November we would actually be anchoring a big faculty development program that brings literally the who's who of people who work in Indian knowledge systems together, and a lot of them are not known outside the academic world, and the kind of tremendous intellectual and courage it has, intellectual effort and courage it has taken for me to say that there is something called an Indian knowledge systems that we can curate into a curriculum. It does not happen by itself. In academia, it takes a certain form. It's been at least a 3-decade effort to locate a place for Indic knowledge systems. So we stand on the shoulders of those giants like Kapil Kapoor ji, Nandas Pathuru ji, and many others who are not, like you said, we come into contact on Twitter and YouTube, but there is a bigger world of knowledge out there, and some of these stalwarts are not known. So we are curating a 18-day faculty development program in partnership with government institutions, and this is really the institutionalization component of Indic knowledge systems. How do we take it deeper, develop a conviction? The new education policy actually gives us a bit of a thrust to that. There is an explicit mention and an assertion of Indic knowledge systems, and I think the mantle is really on us to take this forward, because there is the moment we all. Now I'm speaking to you because there is a certain macro alignment around the civilizational consciousness, right? And whenever this happens, and typical Indian tradition, you respect and you draw your clothes from time, because the macro really always really informs and guides the micro in a certain way. Right? The environment matters. Right? So we are in that moment of civilizational awareness, and our job is to grab that moment and become civilizationally self-assured, to be able to represent that. The knowledge economy or civilizational renaissance, all of this are essentially outward manifestations of how we as people of Bharat come to think of ourselves. Right? If we understand this, then we also understand that Bharat has always been a knowledge economy. Bharat has always been a civilization of knowledge. So you can't have a knowledge economy without a civilization of knowledge, or a culture of knowledge, or a respect for knowledge, right? And that's what we represent. So this is also what animates the program design at Rashtra. It's a 1 year program, and the challenge, the creative challenge for us, and I by no means say that we've solved this. I'm very careful about making a claim that this is something that is resolved. This requires a lot of collaboration, a lot of other people to come in and start thinking about this in different ways. But fundamentally, you have this fount, right? It's also become inaccessible to us because of the language to a certain degree. Right? You and I are speaking in English. The knowledge is in regional languages, in Sanskrit, but also because the education system has trained your cognitive and temperament, cognitive abilities and temperament in a certain way. Now, the creative challenge for us is how do you draw from this fount and make sure that it is relevant in a contemporary sense, it is aspirational, it is accessible, but it is also interesting for young people to engage with, learn, be enriched. Right? So the way we've structured this program is 3 terms, and the first term focuses on, in a contemporary parlance we call meta skills, and these meta skills are about higher level cognition, right? Or skills that will help you achieve or help you acquire newer skills in an easier manner, and something that helps you be relevant when the context around you is changing so rapidly. The intellectual case for actually engaging in a new paradigm of knowledge and education is that there is tremendous complexity in the world, and we are living through one moment in the last 2 years of unbelievable complexity, and how the entire world has to be reconfigured with just one act of nature, right? And when that happens, you understand that some of your existing paradigms and thought modes are obsolete, which means you will have to then be nimble enough to develop new paradigms of thought, and that means you have to really have a highly flexible, adaptive mindset. And the Indian knowledge system is perhaps and I would actually put my neck out and say that it is, in fact, the most significant, expansive, comprehensive exposition of the mind, right? And the mind, body, spirit connection there has ever been. Right? So when we look at this program, we said, what can we draw as ideas which are relevant for public leadership? And in the first term, we focus on 3 essential meta skills. The first one is the idea of Ritachet. It's a core, we structured this Bhartiya consciousness. If there is one word that pervades the Bhartiya consciousness, it is the idea of Rita, which is, of course, expressed as Dharma. Right? That there is a rhythm, there is a cosmic rhythm, there is a flow, there is an inherent integrity to the way things are, and your ability to interact and to connect with that integrity is really a function of your level of consciousness, the level from which you're functioning. So the focus of Indian education and India's philosophy of education was always about how do you refine the interiority, how do you develop, like I said, the physical, emotional, spiritual intelligences in people through the cognitive process to tap into that intelligence, right? So this is in a more contemporary way. This would be systems thinking. How do you look at ecology, economy, politics? How do you think about the interconnections between your culture, society, and your knowledge acquisition mechanisms? How do you think about geography? How do you think about climate? How do you think about seasons? How do you think about terrain? How do you think about energy transformations? How do you think about holism versus reductionism? So this is the subject matter of this first meta skill, the ability to develop a system of inquiry which is multidimensional, that you start looking at one thing by asking questions from different disciplines, and then you use your level of consciousness and rigor to stitch it up, right, to develop a coherent picture. Right? So that's like the landing zone. From there, we focus on something called samskara abhyasa. Samskara abhyasa is really the nerve of Indian knowledge system, in my opinion. Because the theory of yoga is essentially about how to really refine yourself. And refining yourself is understanding your own tendencies. Right? And in the tradition, from an Ayurveda perspective, you get certain idea of your physical and mental constitution. From a Yoga Sutra perspective, you get certain ideas of your chitta, manas, buddhi, aham. And you understand that there is a larger, and this is what modern neuroscience tells us, right? When Jonathan Haidt talks about the elephant and the rider, and he says it's the subconscious self that is riding the. So it is, we have to understand the profundity of that idea, because you built an entire global architecture of systems grounded in this belief that we are all rational beings who are able to compute cost and benefits in all aspects. It doesn't mean that we cannot or we do not attempt to do that, but we must respect that there is a larger self or a larger idea to ourselves than just the idea of reason, right? And there is the unconscious self. And the idea of samskara abhyasa is really to understand your unconscious self and bring that into or foreground that into the realm of your consciousness. And that actually gives you the praxis for elevating your consciousness, right? There is meditation, there is thinking about your food habits, thinking about your thought patterns. Why is there a cyclicity to your thought pattern? Where does this come from? Understanding your own emotions. We speak a lot about emotional intelligence in business literature today, right? And even in politics and in all kinds of corporate trainings. It's very, in my opinion, it is very shallow because we talk about emotions at a surface level, and we think we can train ourselves on those emotions. Try not being angry. How can you do that? If you have to do that, you have to understand your mind a little bit better. And if you have to understand your mind, you'll have to actually slow down your breath a little bit, because without slowing down your breath, you cannot put your awareness. So these are fundamental assets, even in a knowledge economy. The assets that you have is your attention, your focus, your ability to contemplate, your memory. And the Indian knowledge system, when we talk about samskara abhyasa, is fundamentally expanding these dimensions. How do you bring your focus to a certain matter? How do you, bring the ability to summon the right thing at the right time? How do you bring this awareness of what you are going through as an emotion? Do you acknowledge to yourself that you are jealous? Do you acknowledge to yourself that you are actually suffering from a bit of envy? Because if you do not, there is no way that you can empathize with somebody else. It's only what you're able to find in yourself are you then able to empathize with when you find that in others. And if this emotion is hidden, and if this emotion is not accessible to your intelligence, your conscious intelligence, you cannot. And then talking about public policy is actually distant, right? So we focus a lot on the self-awareness component. And the last meta skill that we focus on as part of preparation is tarka, or the idea of logic and argumentation. And this is funny when we talk about the Indian civilization. Some of the critics, you hear them talking about the absence of reason or empirical rigor. For anybody who's actually had even the minutest brush with our knowledge system, it is funny to even say that there is no focus on rigor or empirical understanding or taxonomy. Classification in the Indian tradition or categorization, empirical rigor. What is Ayurveda? How do we think that Ayurveda has come up? Right? Without actually examining the body, without actually examining what it looks like at very, very subtle levels. Right? But there is also a highly developed tradition of dialectics, of argumentation, of actually being able to reason positions out. And all of this comes from the tradition. When we say Indic knowledge systems, it's a composite of Vedic, Buddhist, Jaina, tribal, and folk knowledge systems. And we have this rich fount with the unparalleled, continued human experience that we can tap into. Right? So we focus on logic as the this one. So there is the integral worldview. There is samskara abhyasa, which is knowing your own emotional and psychological selves. And there is the ability to develop your logic and ability to argue. These are the meta skills, right? And then In the next term, we get into the subject matter of constitution, economic reasoning, or research methodologies, international relations. You can think about political philosophies, history of ideas, the idea of development itself. And in the final term, we focus on the idea of leadership action. What are our civilizational role models and examples for leadership? When we think about, and you are a IR person, and you must be thinking in terms of alliances and networks. In my reading of Ramayana, there is tremendous lessons to be drawn about how Sri Rama built alliances. We don't particularly look at it from that perspective, but the one skill that we are lacking beyond everything else today, even on the civilizational side to a certain extent, is the ability to collaborate, is the ability to build strategic alliances towards a certain purpose, right? And there is much to be gained from reading our Itihasa traditions. So this is the subject matter, but we also draw from our civilization on the pedagogy itself, right? The idea of Itihasa and Purana as pedagogical technologies, the idea of storytelling. And this is what gives the civilization its continuity. There is the high philosophy, the contemplation of the deepest and the highest self, but it translates itself into everyday life in a very accessible manner through allegory, through metaphors, through stories, through poetry, through acts of language. And once you start understanding a knowledge tradition in its entirety, you have everything that you need to apply and target at human potential development. So we draw inspiration in terms of the knowledge form. We layer that with a lot of contemporary sense, but more importantly, we innovate on the delivery side. And all of this is experimentation. It doesn't mean that we are able to do all of this well in our first attempt. There is a lot of feedback loop and learning that we are also going through. But this is, my one request and my one sort of assertion to your channel is that this is an attempt worth doing, right? Because it's a hugely creatively satisfying work as well. To understand how a civilization thinks about itself, to be the interlocutor of that civilizational wisdom in an interesting way to your next generation, and to give them different thought models to approach the world from, and not be chained to one kind of thinking that we've all received as part of our education. So that's the work that we do.
I really appreciate that. So, since you mentioned about cultural intelligence, interestingly, I know you mentioned emotional intelligence, not cultural intelligence, but of course, cultural intelligence is a different thing altogether. Um, you very interestingly you mentioned it so right about its shallowness, and as you were explaining the very program that uh, I think you're of course saying that what feedback will be taken and the whole process will go on, and that is certainly appreciated. One interesting realization that I felt, and I wish to share that, is that since you mentioned about the role of, I would say, stories, mores, folklores, and so forth, I think I had a very interesting discussion with an author who had uh, written about uh, the Puranas and the indicators which are there, solar indicators like moon, sun, and so forth. How they're understood by us when we are taught by our parents or when we are taught indirectly in India in such a perpetuated and obvious way. Like, let me give a simple example, and I'm doing it for the viewers because they also get it. Because, of course, I completely understand your philosophical point of view, and of course, the practical aspects. Otherwise, to be very honest, I am a critic also in some ways, not in a bad sense, but in a good sense. That, of
Yeah.
course, something is to be done with meaning. So, let us take the simplest of examples. If anybody says, okay, there's something called Bhugol. Now, this is something which is something very obvious, right? A geoid or a sphere, which we assume. Then the concept of water cycle. We already know, okay, fine, we have rains, they go to the tributaries and so on. And it's so obvious for us that, we just feel it, we understand it. That is something which has been historically very much evident. Because even in the last discussion that I had with Amrita, I had asked that you mentioned about, various stories and so forth. So you mentioned about Ramayana. In fact, Ramayana has very many versions, And it's not just your Ramcharitmanas and the Valmiki Ramayana. There are many Ramayans all across India, and they have their own depictions. They have their own cultural understanding, and so forth. They have some differences, but of course, the unifying factor exists, and or let's say the common factor, not a unifying, but a common factor exists in a much, I would say, reasonable way. So I think I must congratulate for that. And as we are coming to, I would say, the concluding aspects of this discussion, let us discuss about Indic knowledge systems from a perspective of policy and governance, since you mentioned about emotional intelligence. So now my question comes in. Um, so another interesting issue which we see is that the reason why emotional intelligence, which is being taught by any institution, particularly, I'm not talking about your, of course, I'm talking about other institutions in general, they do not even get into the component of naturalization. Now, the good part is that you propose very beautifully that yes, naturalization is an inevitable thing which is needed for the particular individual who is enrolling and his particular development. Of course, when we say a person who is being there, you mentioned psychology, you mentioned spirituality, and there are interpersonal considerations as well. And that is something which is very fundamentally important because from there you think innovatively and in a much different manner. So, okay, one comment to show before I complete my question. So, thank you, Karthik, for this. Really liked it. So, I think interestingly, what is much deterministic here, and I'm being schematic here because that is how the discourse goes in a much reasonable way. I think what I see is that when it comes to Indic knowledge systems, the approach should be the following: that okay, there should be spiritual and interpersonal consideration, which needs to shape up the role of the peoples who are being enrolled. And yes, since that's the case, let us go for a very, I would say, lively understanding of what is continuity, because what happens is when emotional intelligence, and I understand management ethics a lot. In fact, I work in technology law, so I see an intersection of management ethics and AI ethics, and I see the rhetoric there, so save that. But as I see it, I see one thing, that it's very shallow because of the simple reason that it focuses on a highly reductionist and materialist form of view. And what happens is that maybe certain consequences are predictable, but does it lead to the individual and the collective in a way which makes sense, which is pragmatic enough for them? And that is where you are trying to come up with an initiative. Fine, we are teaching you, but we are teaching you the sense wherein you are able to foresee what is there. It's not about predictability or it's not about equilibrium, it's more about adaptability. In fact, there's an economic approach called as complex adaptive systems, which developed in the libertarian school of thought. Even India's, I would say, principal economic advisor, Sri Sanjeev Sanyal, also endorses the concept a lot when he discusses in public meetings. So I think it's much about because the Bhartiya mind has been like that. We adapt to complex situations and then we come up with something new, something nuanced. I That's why I always say to people that there are two institutions which I like a lot. First is yours, and second is another, which is in Academy. So I always talk about, if you want something to start with, at least look at them, and then of course go ahead. So I think now you can put forth your view. Sorry for the question and bit of my views, but yeah, you can go
No,
ahead.
that's great. That's great to know, and I'm glad you mentioned Indic Academy. We're proud to partner with them. I myself benefited tremendously by the work that Indic Academy has done. So I'm always keen to acknowledge that. And like I said, what we need is an institutional approach. Right? It's not so much about me or anybody else speaking about certain ideas. It's about uh, how do you uh, how do you find means of replication, right? How do you make sure that this becomes de facto? Because there is value in it. Like there is, and you have to be sober about and also critical wherever you need to be about the value of this and how it synthesizes. And you have to engage with. We are part of academia, and the one thing that should really guide academia is the pursuit of truth. Right? And for knowledge economy, for fundamental element is knowledge, and for knowledge, the pursuit of truth and culture of pursuit of truth are really the foundations. Right? So I think you broadly laid out the picture of the linkages between public policy, governance, education, ethics. There are all deep subjects to get into. But let me just tell you what I feel with an example, just a moment of epiphany. When I say the metaphysics drives design, right? What does it look like? So, if you pay through Paytm, right? And if you look at if you listen to the notification that comes, right? In English, it would be that, let's say, a payment of 100 rupees was received, but in Hindi, it would be 100 rupees prapt hue. Right? The word prapt has a whole worldview encoded in it. Right? Prapt is a manifestation of karma. Prapt is a manifestation of your ability to actually earn. Right? So when you think about design, the Purushartha model is a very powerful way to think about governance design. The ability to actually balance your rights and duties. The word prapt, in a way, is the synthesis of that. Right? You earned the right to get that 100 rupees by the duty that you performed. Right? Therefore, there is the metaphysics of actually, doing something to getting something and growing by giving. This is the metaphysics of governance. What we need to be talking about, whether it is business design or policy design, is how do we create, to borrow Amrit's words from your previous episode, how do we create fractals that are actually in a positive feedback loop, which has also been the Indian social design. The Indian social design concerned itself with dignity. And how do you give dignity to different communities, and how do you create means and mechanisms for those communities to engage and really be able to govern themselves as much as they can, and let the state, even the modern theory tells us that the state should concern itself with a few but important functions, but it gets dragged into all kinds of social discourse because it does not have the metaphysics to actually ground that. Right? You lost the means, and you haven't actually, in a lot of other ways, other civilizations probably today do not have, particularly the modern institutions, do not have the fundamental element of our Bhartiya civilizational culture, which is Utsav, Upasana. These are the tools that we have, right? The festival, the act of Ratha, where you sacrifice something, transform yourself, and through that engage in a festival, which is an exchange of joy and abundance with each other. These are not esoteric models. These are your functional social models. And if you are able to drop the baggage of coloniality, as Jay Saidipur tells us, you would actually be able to see the society in a completely different light. And you will pick up models of governance, and this will lead to a state where the harmonization of state, market, and community, the third pillar that even the liberals are now talking about, it does not happen by itself. It cannot happen by reason. It cannot happen by rights. It has to happen through a harmonization of duty, exchange, culture, festival, and a synthesis of dignity through community efforts. Right? So this is really, in a very small sort of capsule, the idea of governance. The idea of governance should be, how do I transfer agency? What we call the principle of subsidiarity in public policy. But subsidiarity does not happen through devolution of power alone. It happens through agency created for dignity in communities, and that really is the model of governance for India. Bharat has always been that. The Bharatiya consciousness is about achieving the Purushartha in the individual, and through that achieving solidarity at a community level and creating the right interfaces between communities, and using the means of festival, transformation, sacred, to actually sustain. The one concern that the civilization has always had is sustainability. Right? How do we? You spoke about continuity a lot, right? Continuity comes from having the mechanisms and the thought models to actually endure, to sustain, right? And that is where the idea of Rina, Tapas, Yagya, these are the fundamental ideas of the civilization. The word Prat is the culmination of that Rina, Tapas, and Yagya, right? That there is a debt to be repaid. By your very existence, you incur certain debts. That is the idea of the civilization, and you perform certain nitya karmas to repay those debts. And that is a social bonding that gets created, not because it's a state dictum, not because there's a fear of law, but because there is a metaphysics that tells you that this is the right way to live. And if you think that we can build a civilization even today without this metaphysics, if you think that there is a global civilization possible without the idea of Rena Tapas and Yajna, I only wish people who think they can do it all the very best. My own personal conviction is that without this metaphysics, it's not going to happen.
Indeed. To add on that, I would say very humbly that it's about the way we are cyclic. So let's say, fine. Uh, so even whenever my team at Global Law Assembly researches, or my team at Indian Society at Artificial Intelligence and Law researches, I always tell my people that look at policy all around the world, not just India, all around the world, whether it is a line or whether it is a circle. If it is a circle, of course, it's revolving all around. So it could be like centripetal, but when it becomes centrifugal, it means that it's a line again. So it's like a very common classical problem around the world also that, okay, so let me give an example, and on that note, we can end this. That let us say we come up with any policy, X policy, and we say, fine, this is going to change this, right? That revitalization narrative, fine. But if it is a line, it has a destination, and yes, post that, the threshold is already crossed. You can't do anything about it. The best you can do is to prevent it. That is the exact model of equilibrium, having levers and the supply demand thing. But if it's a cycle, you already know that it's an organic thing. It's like a plant which is growing. It's like a banyan tree which will grow for hundreds of years. If you know, not say hundreds of years, 100 years, ironically. So let's say 100 years. If you're growing for 100 years, you at least know that this much will be cyclic. But what will be the next cyclic procedure is the next challenge. So I think there is something which civilization states like India, even in the West, they have been also suffering from this similar problem. Some have tried to come up with a solution, some have not been able to. But again, I'm not going to specifically comment on who have and who have not. That's not the purpose tonight. But I think on a concluding note, I must say that as we end this discussion, people have a lot to chew and digest about, and also to understand how cyclic consequentiality works when it comes to inequality systems. And of course, as you said, the metaphysical relationship is very much connected. And that let us see how it drives and how outcomes come around. So I think I must say that on a very happy note, I had a really interesting dialogue with you, and yes, I would of course give you a share of course, giving concluding remarks. So please.
No, thank you. I'm delighted to have had this opportunity to talk to you and talk a little bit about Rashtra. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the work that you do. I think we need many organizations working on different dimensions of this civilizational movement. And I'm incredibly happy, just with the small team that you have and using the digital means, the kind of aesthetics that you created, the kind of range that your team addresses, both as research and dialogue mediators. So thank you, Edwardon, and I hope to see you in many fora, and hope to have an association with Indus Think and everything that you guys do. And all the best.
Definitely. Thank you so much. I would be really happy to converse with you post live session. So please just wait for a while. So as we conclude, I had actually posted that there will be a cyberpunk surprise. So, I'm a poet. I write poems in English and Hindi, ironically. And Indo-European music and Indo-European literature is very amazing. It ranges from your Eastern Europe to ASEAN. So, if anybody has watched Eurovision 2021, then the trailer which I'm going to show for the next episode of Indus Think is going to surprise you. So, enjoy this trailer in a little bit. And yeah, so let's go. So you have got your surprise. We are having an interview with Goe, which is a Ukrainian band. They are an alternative rock band which produces some really amazing music. You can listen to their song Shum. It relates to the pagan rituals as well as the Indo-European rituals. We talked about I had an episode recently with them, and we really discussed about significance of the fusion of sun and the spring traditions. And if somebody watches the performance they gave in Eurovision, that was incredibly awesome. It's one of the most unique performances. Ironically, they came fifth based on the public voting. The jury did not give them enough, but I think it's much inspiring. So a lot is to be revealed there. So do watch it on October 6th. And as you know, that Internationalism Global Podcast is a broadcasting partner for IndoCon 2021. Do await that three amazing panels are coming tomorrow. The one which is on AI hype with some experts around the world. The second, artificial intelligence in the Indo-Pacific, and the last one is again continuing the discussion of Dharma and Dita when it comes to what we call as technocratic prakriti. So tomorrow, some really amazing panels are coming in. I wish that all of you watch it, share it, and yeah, we are open to learn from you. We hope that you learn from the discussion a lot, and that's how the discourse goes. So, with this, we conclude this episode 12 of Indus Think. And Raghavji, thank you so much for coming. Really happy to have your ages.
Thank you so much, Abra. Fantastic talking to you.